and welcome to another episode of the Life After Cardiac Arrest podcast with me, your host, Paul Swindell. Today I'm speaking with another survivor, and his name's Ted Guloien from Toronto in Canada. Welcome.
Good morning, Paul.
How are you doing?
I'm very well on this grey day in Toronto.
I really wanted to speak to you because I've known of you for probably 4 or 5 years, and you've always put very insightful posts and wise posts. And so I've always listened to what you've said. And it was only recently when I actually asked you whether you would come on the podcast, because you've posted something which is, I guess, a summation of all of those posts that you've done over the years. And hopefully we're going to talk a little bit about that, which is your publication, or you call it a pamphlet, but I think that's probably underselling it somewhat, which is titled Observations of a Sudden Cardiac Arrest Survivor and subtitled What I'd Wish I'd Been Told When I Was Discharged. And what really piqued my interest is your background in social psychology. And I just wondered if you could tell me a little bit about that, and also a little bit about briefly your cardiac arrest story.
Sure. Well, thank you very much for the glowing introduction. My education in university was in social psychology, and then for my master's degree, I took a 2-year program in applied social psychology, which was taking the art and science of psychology and trying to apply it to the real world outside of the academic sphere. And also, I entered the PhD program for clinical psychology, but grew disenchanted with that and went and joined a consulting firm and applied my skills there. So my background is in social psychology, and particularly in the research end of it. So have done some very large scale studies on pornography in Canada, but we won't talk about that.
I was going to say, to a layperson, what is social psychology?
It's trying to understand people's social behaviors, as opposed to like personality psychology, which would be what makes Paul tick. It's more what makes Paul's interaction with Ted tick, or Paul in a social situation, or how do people tick. So how do people interpret and deal with what other people say, that sort of thing. In terms of my cardiac arrest, I had been working with a group of guys, 3 people, for 30 years in the consulting business. We had a small practice, and we were just winding that up in 2013. And my wife and I took a trip to celebrate that to France, where I rented a bicycle and climbed Mont Ventoux, which is part of the Tour de France. And coming down the hill, had a flat tire, realized I had no cell phone communication, but that's fine, fixed the tire and landed safely, and we went home. And about a month later, I decided to enter a half marathon with my daughter, who was 23 at the time. And off we went on this half marathon adventure with my wife waiting for us at the finish line. My daughter quickly pulled ahead, and I was fine with that. And I remember the race very vividly. It was a beautiful, crisp fall day in November. I remember running toward the lake, running beside the lake, thinking this is just wonderful. And 3 days later, I woke up in a hospital. And that's pretty much my cardiac arrest. I have no memory of the intervening time, and only had the stories of other people to, much like many survivors, only the stories of other people to fill in those gaps, which is a disconcerting sort of experience, as you well know.
Uh-huh. You said you were doing a half marathon.
Yep.
Was this and that you mentioned that you had been cycling in France as well. So were you? It sounds like you're a pretty fit guy.
I had done at that point 26 marathons, including 5 in Boston, which is a hard one to get into. 5 in New York, 1 in Australia. I mean, a bunch of marathons. And yeah, I was a runner. I was an avid runner. And interestingly, I think that sort of worked against me in the healthcare system, in that I was given a pass by a cardiologist to run that half marathon. And that might have not been the most sage advice, but there it was. I had
had you seen a
sorry.
cardiologist for a particular reason then, prior to the actual event?
Yeah, and I'm not a poster boy for listening to physicians, but I had experienced angina about 6 months prior. Went to see a cardiologist who threw me on the treadmill. So I did the stress test and passed with flying colors, except there was a 2 centimeter depression or something in my ST segment, which suggested that there was some sort of a blockage. But they gave me a 3% probability that I would have a major cardiac event. And I think that's driven by an algorithm based on a bunch of factors, some subjective and some objective, like the treadmill stress test. But I think I was given a bit of a pass there, thinking this is a guy who runs every day, who's run 26 marathons. And so what are the odds that there's something serious here? They're probably minimal. Yet, so I was put on a regimen of atorvastatin and told to keep my heart rate low, and that eventually over time, the prognosis was that smaller arteries and veins would open up in the heart and everything would be okay. And indeed, within 3 months, the angina completely disappeared and things seemed very fine. And then I ran the ill-fated half marathon.
You said you were running it with your daughter. Is she a good runner? Were you in competitive dad mode and trying to keep up with her?
That's a very good question, Paul, and you're too observant. You know, it's funny. It's funny because we had run 2 half marathons over the last, say, 8 months, and both times I beat her by a good margin. So there was a bit of competition. However, this race I felt pretty good that she was pulling away, and I was very content to let her do that, given the experience I just had at the cardiologist. And I thought I'll run this race to enjoy it as opposed to try to beat my daughter. Plus, it'd be nice for her to have a win that was legitimate. So no, I wasn't really trying to catch her. I just think it was a confluence of circumstances, perhaps. And it's still not clear why that race and why not on the top of Mont Ventoux in France that I had this cardiac arrest.
And so what happened? You didn't actually get to finish the race?
I was very close. It was my first race I've never finished. I think so. Good reason.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you know what happened exactly? Who stepped in to help you and the circumstances?
There was a competitive swimmer who, for one reason or another, wanted to run this race but couldn't. He rushed to my aid along with a pregnant nurse, and they both started to do CPR. A physician who happened to be walking along, just going for her morning walk, administered an EpiPen. And then rather quickly, the race medical people, St. John's ambulance, came and continued the CPR. And there was a whole chain of people then doing CPR. And because it was the finish line, there was a medical tent very close by, and they brought the AED down. But unfortunately, the AED couldn't restore any rhythm, and it wasn't until the EMS came in their ambulance that they got a faint bit of rhythm from my heart.
Bystanders, yeah, but by the sounds of it, educated in this sort of field, really. If you've got a nurse and a doctor, you couldn't have had 2 better passerbys, really. And one interesting thing there, you said the doctor administered an EpiPen. I mean, I just associate an EpiPen with people with, is it allergies? Is that right? What is an EpiPen exactly, and why would they administer it on you?
That's exactly true. It's typically for peanut allergies or bee stings, that sort of thing. And why maybe she had her own allergy and was carrying it for personal use. But it's also has been used to help with getting hearts beating again, like a shot of epinephrine.
That's what the EPI is a shortened for epinephrine.
Exactly.
And I think in the UK we know that as adrenaline, isn't it? I think.
That's true. Yep. So that was very lucky. I mean, that she just happened to be there.
Do you know whether that had any effect on you or not?
Well, I've since, like I think many survivors do, tried to research everything that happened, and there is some debate as to whether administering epinephrine or adrenaline to people in cardiac arrest is a wise thing to do. But I have no idea whether it had a negative or positive impact.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there was a study that came out earlier this year about that subject, and I think the conclusion was that you get slightly more survivors, but sometimes you get people perhaps might have been better off not surviving, so
Okay.
they're possibly more or less neurologically intact.
Oh,
But
dear. Yeah.
but I don't think it was like really clear, a clear difference. So I think it was a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's a problem in general with research into survivors, is that there's so few of us and the conditions are so variable that it's hard to come to conclusions.
Absolutely, yeah. And okay, perhaps we can sort of. What was your experience in the sort of Canadian health system post discharge? Bearing in mind that I guess having a psychologist background, you sort of wouldn't. I'm guessing anyway that you have some sort of understanding of the sort of things that people might go through when they've gone through a trauma.
Frankly, no. I think much like every survivor I've ever spoken with, I was as confused as the next person, and had no insight into what was happening to me and how I was experiencing this. That came later, Paul, largely after listening to and reading other people's comments online about the experience, the shared experience. I began to get some insight into what was happening to me. I felt quite helpless, and the medical system in Canada is as wonderful as it is, single payer and all that. It was all about the heart and the physical aspect of my health, and nothing to do with the mental anguish or potential mental challenges coming home.
Mm-hmm. What sort of state were you in when you were discharged?
Apart from crying in the car from the hospital, I was, physically, I had a minimally invasive bypass, which means they didn't open up my chest cavity through the sternum, but went between the ribs and left my heart beating while they did it. So the implications of that were not so bad to deal with. So I was physically very, very well. I couldn't run anymore. I couldn't walk to the end of the street without getting out of breath. But psychologically, it was interesting in that when there weren't people around and when there wasn't a regimented activity to do, I was quite despondent and confused and overwhelmed by what had happened and disbelief that it had happened, in spite of the fact that I had the scars to prove it.
Mm-hmm. So how long were you in hospital for?
This whole thing took a week.
Oh, that's quite quick, really.
Yeah. It was a Sunday I had the cardiac arrest, and it was Remembrance Day, the 11th of November, when I was discharged. So not a long time, but that's the way the healthcare system works.
Uh-huh. So when you were discharged, you're presumably back to your family home, and was it just were there many people around there? You said you felt quite lonely. Did you mean in terms of no one else around, or the fact that you didn't really know any other cardiac arrest survivors?
It was a bit of both, in that I had my arrest in a city maybe 60, 70 miles away from here. So, but coming home, my children were out of the house, so it was just my wife and I. And when she went back to work, I was left to my own devices. But even then, when she was there, I felt rather alienated because of the experience. And I had a difficult time trying to communicate that feeling of alienation and differentness. So I mostly didn't try.
Uh-huh. Is that why you went online?
I went online for exactly that reason, was trying to find someone who could tell me what I was going through and help me figure out what I was going through. And what I did find was a bunch of people who were much the same condition I was, their state, in varying degrees of progress through that, who were sharing what they were going through, which gave me some comfort.
And this was how soon after your cardiac arrest would you have gone online looking for answers or help?
I just think it was probably within the first couple of months of getting home when I had some free time to do that sort of thing.
Uh-huh.
And then I did go to cardiac rehab, but cardiac rehab in Canada, at least, is really tailored to people who have had heart attacks and who are dealing with arterial sclerosis. And they were, when I first met them, they were trying to be accommodating and saying, well, we're going to put you in with a young group. I was 60 at the time, so that kind of scared me. But so they're going to put me in a young group, and this young group were not particularly young, but I suppose in the demographic they deal with, they were young. But it was all focused on diet and exercise and lifestyle modification, which for me was what I'd been doing for the last 30 years, was eating well and exercising well and all that sort of thing. So I was a bit of an anomaly. I felt like even more isolated in that group.
I think that's quite a common story from for quite a few people I've spoken to, who you don't always get the rehab in this country unless you've had a heart attack as your cause of your cardiac arrest. I don't know if that's the same in Canada, but if you do get it, then a lot of people say that it's not really gauged for them, although they do get benefits from doing it. Psychological aspect of it is not so prevalent in what they're trying to help you with.
Well, I think, Paul, the big benefit for me was, not the lectures on what fiber does and that sort of thing, but rather they would give you an exercise prescription. And they made a point of calling it a prescription. And they took what I thought was a rational scientific approach by throwing everybody onto a treadmill, and with the ECG, blood pressure cuff, blood oxygen levels being monitored. And plus they're monitoring your oxygen intake. So a VO2 max stress test on a treadmill to establish your base strength in terms of your heart. And then middle of the program, at the end of the program, they measured those things to see what progress was. And then they wrote a prescription for me saying, here's the kind of exercise you can do. Here's the limits of that. Now get out there. And for me, that restored my confidence, because I'd felt so betrayed by my heart. And as I said in the pamphlet as well, that betrayal, that lack of confidence in my heart sort of expanded into other aspects of my life, where I began to feel a loss of confidence in my own self. And the cardiac rehab exercise program restored a bunch of that.
Well, that's good to hear, because I was wondering whether, being a fit guy, whether the sort of exercises that they'll give you, whether it'll be enough for you, and maybe you would feel that it wasn't very fulfilling.
It was incredibly frustrating, the exercise programs they were giving us, because they wanted us to start at a very basic level of walking. And I remember in the hospital, when I was in recovery from the surgery, I was trying to do laps around the hospital ward in my slippers and gown. And the nurses would stop me saying, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Well, I don't want to lose my tone on my legs. I got to run with it." And they just laughed and escorted me back to my bed.
Very good. Okay, so perhaps we could come on to the sort of psychological aspect of things, which I guess is it is why I wanted to speak to you in your booklet, pamphlet, or whatever you want to call it, because you recently published into the international group, if you like, this PDF, and as I said, it was observations of a sudden cardiac arrest survivor. You've put a lot of very wise things together, and I've seen a lot of people say, I wish I'd had that when I was discharged or when I was in hospital, and I totally agree with them. And I'd just like to go through a number of the sections of it, perhaps breaking it down into bigger blocks. And the first one, your first sort of chapter is really sort of, you say about the brain fog and memory, and the sort of, I class that under my favourite word of sequelae, and a couple of other chapters a little bit later on, you say about anger and sadness and lack of verbal filter as well. And I would sort of put them all together under a similar title, really, and just wondered what your own personal experiences of on that, and also what you've seen in online as well from other survivors.
Sure. My observations, I think, as you alluded to earlier, were based on things that I had written, largely written earlier, and that for me was a form of therapy. My feelings and my personal observations about what I was going through down on paper helped me get through those things. So this was largely an accumulation of many of those observations that were, I thought, themes that I'd picked up from other people in the group. But in terms of the memory fog, I think that was my very first observation. Once my wife had gone back to work and I was alone in the house, I would find myself staring at the fridge in the basement, wondering what I was down there for. Or I know my wife would get irritated because I would continually forget what she'd asked me just to do. And sometimes she would be rather short. And because I think she sort of wondered if I was doing this purposefully, just wasn't paying attention, listening, or didn't care enough to listen. So the memory fog, that whole thing, and I know that other people have, that was a common theme on the sites, the whole memory issue. Many people ascribe it to the hypoxia or anoxia from the lack of oxygen during the attack, but I also think it can be due to other factors, which I stated in the pamphlet. Just the overwhelming experience. My mind anyways, was very distracted, easily distracted. I found it very difficult to read because of the inability to attend to one thing at a particular time. And I think that comes down to the brain fog. But whether that's anoxia or just the psychological experience or maybe some of the medications that people take, it's not clear to me.
Mm-hmm. I think it's probably not clear to a lot of scientists, really. It's a lot of it's still early, there's not a lot of research out there, I believe, on us. I guess it is difficult picking those pieces apart. I had the brain fog and the memory issues and some of the other things that you mentioned, but for 2 years I didn't actually receive any medication, so I knew it was nothing to do with the actual medication in my own personal aspect of things.
Yeah.
So.
And how did you cope with it, or did you?
Not very well. I mean, it was similar to you, really. My memory was terrible. It took me, the focus and the concentration issue was a real problem. I'm still not great at it, to tell the truth. And reading it took me a good 2 years or so before I could read anything more than maybe a paragraph and be able to actually take in what it said. And I think people just don't realise the implications of I believe it's the anoxia or hypoxia affecting your brain. I've seen a couple of studies about how it affects the hippocampus, and I believe that sort of plays a major part in a lot of these functions that we see survivors struggling with. And I sort of put 2 and 2 together. I'm not a scientist or a doctor or anything like that, so I could be getting 5 from my 2 and 2 equation. But to me, a lot of it makes sense at why some of these problems people are experiencing is down to the lack of oxygen.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember at the hospital. Again, after coming out of the coma, I was sent down to a cath lab where they were looking at the extent of the damage to my cardiac arteries, looking for where the blockage was. And in real time, we had this conference with a surgeon, my cardiologist, my wife and I, where the cardiologist and surgeon were saying, you got a choice here to make in terms of, how we're going to proceed. So do you, Mr. Guloien, want a bypass, a traditional bypass? You want a through the rib bypass, or do you want to just not have a bypass and risk your life? And in hindsight, I thought that's a remarkable decision to be putting in the hands of someone who just, has been struck dizzy by this experience. Yet there I was. So that to me struck me as a particularly odd thing. And secondly was, at the end of all this, my cardiologist sort of looking me up and down saying, when my wife asked the question, should he be seeing a neurologist or something? My cardiologist looked me up and down and said, "No, I think he's okay. I think he's come out okay." But how he came to that conclusion is beyond me.
Yeah, I think perhaps we do ourselves a disservice, really, in that the brief time that we're with medical professionals, there probably are mainly cardiologists who are just primarily looking at our heart, and to all intents purposes, we look okay. We can talk, most of us, and we can walk, and so that's a good result as far as they're concerned. And I don't know if you know the cerebral performance category, I think it's called, and that's quite often a measure that they use to gauge how well people have done after an event like this.
Right.
And it's a very coarse scale. There's only five. 5 is dead, 4 is a vegetative state,
Jeez.
3 is severely disabled, 2 is you could have some brain injury, but can live a relatively independent life, although you may need some support. And 1 is a good outcome, but it still acknowledges that you may have some deficits. And I think probably most people who are on Facebook in their own right are probably a category 1, which is good. And but as I say, it still acknowledges that people may have problems, and it doesn't really delve down into what a lot of those problems could be. And I do know that there is a research project that's going to be started soon, looking into perhaps a new scale for cardiac arrest survivors to sort of take into all the factors that we go through. So obviously that sort of thing doesn't happen quickly, but I think it's good that someone's actually starting to look into that.
Yeah. I don't blame the cardiologists. I think it's a systems issue. The cardiologists, they did their job, but I think the system should have jumped in and said, okay, at discharge, this is where we can make a difference. Mm-hmm. That's sadly lacking.
Yeah, I totally agree. So going on to the sort of next bit of your book, I guess is sort of psychological bit, which is about, I've grouped a number of them together, which is, I think it was the second part in your book, is I am not the same person. I mean, I may look the same, but I feel different. Conversely, people who maybe you speak to, that you tell them about your experience, how you died, in air quotes there, but they just don't get it. And just wondered if you could sort of tell me a little bit about your own experience of that and what you see other people going through.
That's an interesting phenomenon, this notion that I'm not the same person. I strongly felt it. And what I find fascinating is that now today, so many years later, I have a less of an understanding or memory of what that experience was like and what it's all about. I look back and think, what could I have been thinking? And how could I have been thinking those thoughts? Because I don't particularly feel that way anymore, which I think is, to me, is great comfort. But for a lot of other people, I'm not sure that they actually have come to that, and they are rather still living as another person. So trying to describe now what that felt like, I just felt that somehow I had changed, and yet that change I couldn't really speak to or define very clearly. And it became a bit of a secret, because it's not something I wanted to share with people either, because it just seems so wacky that I'm not the same person. And it seemed to be a very fundamental difference, a real core identity issue, as opposed to superficial things like I'm having a difficult time reading anymore. It seemed to be more basic and core to my personality. People did not notice any difference in me. I was never did someone come up and say, you've changed or anything like that. Yet I was quite expecting it, but it never was delivered. But yeah, I mean, in terms of the I died thing, for me, that I used that, I think, for a little while, because it gave me some power or something in speaking to people. But I began to realize that I was using it, and I didn't really believe it. And I don't think many people didn't believe it either. They would challenge it and say, we get into an intellectual discussion about what death is, and I just didn't want to go there. So I stopped saying I had died and just said I had a cardiac arrest and moved on. But that's the not the same person thing, I think, is something that many people seem to share. And I find that a very fascinating thing trying to understand. And I can tell you right now, I still don't understand it, but I think there's something there that's worth delving into.
Absolutely, yeah. I think that the finding normal is a big part of life after cardiac arrest. I know I didn't actually see him, but the hospital I was at, they had a psychiatrist that people could see, and he's featured in a film that they did, and he talks about the sort of, I can't remember what he's called, adaptation syndrome or something like that, about how people adapt after a big traumatic event like this. And I guess that's part of the feeling different bit, and actually becoming at one with oneself, the new person, finding out what it's all meant for them. Because the fact that you don't say that you died anymore, I went through I struggled for a long time how to talk about it, because unless you do say the word died or I was dead, or use a kind of heavy word like that, people don't get the gravity of the situation, I think, and perhaps they confuse it with some of the other. They may have known, maybe they're a relative or someone who had maybe a silent heart attack, or someone who was in and out of hospital in an afternoon to have a stent or something like that because they had angina, and they may conflate the two to be the same. And that's why I always used to say died, and I always used to do it in air quotes, but I always struggled as well, as I said, because people also used to confuse it with heart attacks.
Yeah. I think, as a society, at least in North America, the idea of death, it's a big deal, and it's I think the meaning of death is something that people carry around. Big bags of meaning of death. So having gone through, saying you died has a lot of meaning, a lot of weight, as you said, gravitas. So I think, it's something we use to emphasize the seriousness of the situation, without perhaps meaning necessarily that we actually physically died. Yet it's trying to get the point across. And and one thing I was thinking is that a lot of the emotional sequelae you're talking about from the cardiac arrest, they may be the same sequelae from any significant trauma. I don't know, but I haven't experienced trauma until I had my cardiac arrest.
Yeah, you're right. It's true. This is a fairly, I guess, a relatively new problem, really, sort of having the right language and meanings to describe these sort of things, because 40, 50 years ago, we wouldn't have had very many people in this situation that have, again, in air quotes, died and came back to be able to talk about it. If someone perhaps had an arrhythmia where they were in VF and maybe they had a self-correcting arrhythmia, they wouldn't have known about that, really, and maybe they would have just thought they had fainted. And I do know that others have in the UK group have experienced that. Actually, they were told they were just fainting, and it was only years later that they actually had it recorded that they were going into the VF and essentially temporarily dying for numbers of seconds, and in one case I think it was over a minute, before they actually had a full-blown cardiac arrest that needed external intervention.
Right.
But we need the lexicon of language around this subject to be, I don't know, explored perhaps.
Yes, and then we're left, I think, largely to interpret the significance and meaning behind what happened to us, which I think is a very interesting phenomenon. As human beings, we want to understand things, and it's funny how we are left to seek meaning and understanding of this all by ourselves, pretty much.
Yeah, that nicely dovetails into the next bit, which was about worldview challenges and people finding meaning or finding a new purpose in their life?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's a very interesting phenomenon, and I think it's actually a beautiful phenomenon. But people come out of this confused and searching, and some manage to extract some positive, some helpful, positive growth out of the experience, which I find very encouraging. And largely because they're trying to attach meaning, trying to find significance in what happened. Like, why me? Why was I chosen to die? Air quotes. And why was I chosen to be saved or come back from the death? And you see all sorts of, I mean, there's religious connotations to this. There's just I'm a darn special person, and I'm not going to go any further than that. But it's very interesting phenomenon how people interpret what happened to them, as opposed to just, I've got this condition that led to ventricular fibrillation, and my heart stopped.
Mm-hmm. I wonder, though, sometimes when people do put a special significance on it, and that maybe a certain power has picked them out, and that they're adding an extra burden to their recovery, making them, a real psychological burden, essentially. What do you think about that?
How so?
Well, like you say, I've been saved by my. Why should that be? Why they then struggle with trying to find a reason why they survived and why they've been picked out.
Right. Yeah, and I think that, but I think having the explanation for some is quite satisfactory, and the practice then of trying to figure out why, or even harder to pay back, becomes something that can be easily put off. Mm-hmm. I think the understanding of why me, is because the Lord or whomever chose me to because of some reason. I think that having the explanation that the Lord chose me is probably gets you 90% of the way there to feeling pretty good about things. I'm not sure that people need to actually go any further than that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and the next sort of group you've already sort of touched on, and I think it was sort of nicely summed up by a post you did do. It was betrayed. I think it was entitled "Betrayed by My Body," and you did another post as well about how your heart had let you down. The fact that you'd seen yourself as, you mentioned earlier, you'd had a pretty healthy existence up until that point. And how perhaps you had less confidence in your body afterwards, and that you were perhaps, I don't know if it was for you personally, but there was a certain amount of shame or embarrassment for some people, certainly, who had got to that point in their lives. But what's your take on that? Or can you tell me what you've put in the book about those sort of things, confidence and the shame and the embarrassment?
Yeah, the lack of confidence. I mean, that's totally me. I felt very much betrayed by my heart, which is an odd thing to say because I am my heart. But yeah, I felt extremely let down. As far as in my naive grasp of the world, this is not supposed to happen to me. Is kind of the selfish, childish, naive way of putting it. This is not supposed to happen to me. I mean, I was a marathoner. This doesn't happen to marathoners in my way of thinking. And there was a certain amount of embarrassment about that. I mean, how do I explain this to the running community, to the people I had grown up running with, that I had did a DNF, did not finish in a half marathon because my heart let out? It just seemed like an embarrassing story. There was a very famous runner named Jim Fixx who wrote a book about running. And he apparently had an unknown congenital heart issue, and he died while running. And that was a bit of a joke in the running community, a sick joke, a black dark joke. And I sort of felt like that here I'm the Jim Fixx of Toronto now, which is totally silly and totally selfish and self-centered. But I think that's where I was as a survivor, very much self-centered and self-focused, and thinking, "Oh, poor me." So I did feel a certain amount of shame, having had a cardiac arrest, having my heart let me down in a race, particularly. I think if it happened during sleep, I would have felt better about it.
Do you think it affected your identity or your status in the community of runners and the wider world, really?
No, I think, Paul, to be honest, I think this is all in my ego and in my head. I don't think my status changed externally at all. People were encouraging me to get back out there and run, and when's the next marathon, that sort of thing. For me, it was I needed to build up my confidence that I could run again. And every time I had a premature ventricular contraction when I was running, I would have to stop and look at my watch, and then thinking the watch is probably wrong. I'd have to feel my pulse in my neck, and okay, I'm alive. I can keep going.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned that in the rehab was very good for your confidence. Would you say that the trust was built back up in your heart from that?
Yes, because they gave me a very explicit prescription saying that I could take my heart to a certain level, but it was a conservative level. I knew I could take my heart higher, up to 160 or more, but they were saying you might not want to go that high because you'll get premature ventricular contractions. So keep it down to 140. But there's no limit what you can do as long as you manage your heart rate below 140. And that gave me a lot of confidence. And so I would run as opposed to looking at my time or my pace for running. Now it became a matter of looking at my heart rate. And eventually over time, I just stopped looking. And that's when I knew that I had turned some sort of a corner in terms of confidence in my heart and my body again. And that extended to other parts of my life as well. I just began to feel more confident in myself.
Mm-hmm. How long did that sort of take, just to give other people an idea? I know everyone's probably going to be different, but is it a matter of weeks, months, or even years?
Paul, I think honestly it was 3 years before I began to feel like I was again the captain of my own ship here.
Mm-hmm.
It took a while.
Mm-hmm. And what about getting back to perhaps doing a half marathon again, or going on long distance cycle rides?
Well, that's a sore issue around this household as to whether I can do half marathons again. I did do one 2 years after, and it was fine. It was fun. But my wife, I didn't realize, was very upset about that. And this past fall, I had been training for another half marathon and thinking that I would do a training run of 21 kilometers and show her that things were okay. And she was very disappointed. So I've kind of given up that idea only out of respect for the trauma that she went through, not to do that again.
Mm-hmm.
So I do compete. I do compete in shorter distance races, but until she says that she's comfortable with me doing a half marathon, I don't think I'll attempt that again.
Mm-hmm. Even though the cycling, I did see you do go out on your bike quite a lot, but that has its own hazards as well. I saw one post that you did where you had some nasty injuries from it.
Oh dear, yeah. The cycling is I think is less stressful on my heart. It's a lot harder to get up to a high heart rate on a bike, but I do quite a bit of cycling and long distance cycling. But I do think I agree with you. The consequences of cycling are not going to be in my heart. It's going to be the traffic, which, yeah, that's a different issue.
Uh-huh. I think you've reflected on the fact that you had various scrapes and bruises to say that you were basically still here, and that it was, sort of woke you up to the world. But there was another aspect of it which I thought was quite interesting, and it's something that I've thought as well. And it was about the longing to have a photo of when you were actually in ICU.
Yes.
Have you got over that yet?
Yeah, I've gotten over that. I think it would be. I was curious as to why no one took a picture. Then I began to reflect: why would someone take a picture? It seemed like a kind of a morbid thing to do. And I tried to put myself in my wife or my children's position of here's someone I love being told that they're not going to make it. Would I actually whip out my cell phone and start taking pictures? I can't see myself doing that. So I certainly don't hold it against anyone they didn't take pictures, but it would have been fun to have one.
I think maybe it would be good for maybe a third party to actually take it, and then once you're out of the woods, hand it over, as it were, to show that you are okay. But if you don't make it, or that person doesn't make it, then it can just be deleted or whatever.
I think, Paul, I think that's a brilliant idea. But I think that, part of the reason for this is, and I don't know if you've experienced it, but it's the fact that I have no memory. There's no proof that any of this happened, except I know that I was in a hospital intellectually, but there's still something missing.
I totally agree. It's like a jigsaw puzzle with loads of bits missing. And I sort of used to say to people, I'm looking for the pieces. And that's why I used to sort of grill my wife and grill that person and this person who might be able to give me some answers. I stopped doing that now because I know I was causing distress to her, but there is the innate need to know what happened.
Well, I eventually went and requested my medical records, and I thought that might be a window into and help me clear this up. And not so much trying to understand what the physicians were seeing, but again, just some sort of tangible, something I could hold on to say that, yeah, this really did happen to me. And it wasn't very satisfying.
You believe it did happen, though?
I do. When I read the report that I was writhing in the emergency room but unconscious, that helped.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, we sort of touched on the sort of next area, which is guilt, actually. And that's not just survivor's guilt, but also guilt for causing your family stress. And, I know that my wife was involved in my rescue, so I've probably put her through the most traumatic experience that she's ever going to go through. And I do feel guilty for that. But I've always struggled to get the concept of survivor's guilt in our scenarios. But I wonder if you could tell me about what you've got in the book from that point of view.
Well, it's interesting, and it sounds like a fiction, but on the first anniversary of my cardiac arrest, I didn't say I drove my wife to work and then I just kept going. I drove to the city where I had the attack, and I found the exact location that I went down by using the coordinates in my GPS watch that I was wearing during the race. So I went back on the anniversary thinking maybe if I stood on the spot, I would feel something. I would feel a memory, or just I would feel something, because I wasn't feeling anything. And so I went out there on this November day, and there was very few people there. It was on a path running along the lake, and I found the spot, and I stood there thinking, there was nothing. But as I walked back to my car, kind of disappointed, I got a text from one of my running partners who said, "Did you read about the death at the half marathon?" And the half marathon was the same one I ran, but it was the day before my visit. And I said, no. And then he explained that some runner, a little bit younger than I was at the time, had just was approaching the finish line and had a cardiac arrest and went to the hospital and died. And it shocked me that I hadn't heard about it, but it also shocked me because here I was standing in the park where I had my cardiac arrest, and someone a year later just died from a cardiac arrest. But when I read about this fella, and he was an avid runner, much like I was, and he and I had run many races together, but not knowing who we were. Yet, and he was attended to by the same people who attended to me, went to the same hospital I did, yet he died. And the more I read about the guy, the more I began to feel undeserving of surviving, because he was such a nice guy. Everyone said he was a nice guy. He was known in the local running community as a really nice guy. He was a very religious guy, and that to me was my experience with survivor's guilt, because I felt that somehow he deserved to live more so than I did, because I know me, and this guy sounded so much nicer and better, to a point where I wrote an article and submitted it to the local newspaper as a bit of an obituary, but more of my expression of who he and I were and what happened and how much I missed him, even though I never met him. And his family were overwhelmed by this. They loved it. But that was, for me, was what survivor's guilt was about. And it wasn't religious, but it didn't last long, but I felt sort of funny that he died and I didn't. And I know it's all random, but he seemed like such a nice guy.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of what I put my family through, I felt extraordinarily bad about that. Not that I should, but I did, because I chose to run that day. And just reflecting on what it must have been for them, because they never mentioned anything about it. They never said they felt, how horrible it was for them. It was just me reflecting on the fact that my daughter waiting for me at the finish line, walking the course backwards, trying to find me. Where is he? He should be right behind me. And my wife going through the same experience. I mean, I feel terrible for that.
Mm. Well, yeah, it's a lot to unpack there. I mean, I think it's amazing what you did with the obituary, and I don't think there's any way that any of us should feel guilty for surviving. But what you've said there, I can understand why you felt the way you did. I just think if it's not guilt, I just want to do more to improve the chain of survival, because if I do that, I know that there'll perhaps be less people who succumb to it. But yeah, it's not an easy one.
No, I mean, mine was it's a very an emotionally based thing, and I think it's a bit, again, self-focused, but it is what it is.
Mm-hmm. Okay, the last sort of section that you've got in your book really is about I'll class them sort of perhaps mental health type issues, where you've got fear of the future and PTSD and symptom sensitivity. I guess a lot of us go through a phase soon after. I know I did. Although I never really felt that I had any cardiac symptoms prior to my arrest. I haven't really had any since, but I know I was more sensitive to all those heartbeats and when you had an odd one here and there. But I don't know whether it was that just a mental issue, as it were, a mental health issue, being more aware and sensitive to these sort of things. What's your take on all of these?
Yeah, I think I suspect it's a very natural phenomenon to feel that way and to be very perceptive and over perceptive. But you see it in many very varied expressions where people. It's people talk about they ask the question, they pose the question, have you noticed your thighs hurting since your cardiac arrest when you're running? And people are looking to explain, I think, pretty common phenomena like pains and aches of getting older, or pains and aches from running or playing rugby, to something that they can grasp onto, like the cardiac arrest.
Mm-hmm.
And fear of the future, I think, is you hear that's people with the implanted defibrillators are very, I think, very sensitive to having that instrument in their bodies, and quite rightly so. It's a kind of an alien entity inside your body, and it can potentially save you, which is great, but also can give you a shock which no one wants to get. So there's a bit of fear of having that sort of thing in there as well. The PTSD, I don't think is something I've experienced, but I noticed other people have pretty acute reactions to triggers that put them in an awful state. And I don't think I've experienced anything quite like that. And fear of the future, I think, is something also that is pretty normal. And I think over time, though, life just got in the way, and I couldn't devote much energy to that, given that I was expected to be making dinner now, and sitting there dwelling over the future is not going to get that done. Mm-hmm. But I think for some people, this could be very debilitating.
Absolutely.
And I feel bad for them, because there's not much out there that's ready to help them.
I don't know what services you'll get out in Canada, but counselling, I feel is a key part of helping people come to terms with what's happened with them. But although there is counselling services available, mental health services are under a lot of pressure in the UK, and I'm sure that's probably true in a lot of countries. But there's no sort of dedicated or trained cardiac arrest counsellors that I know of, anyway.
But I think, Paul, like what you're doing with the Sudden Cardiac Arrest UK, having a forum where people feel comfortable and safe enough to express some of these very personal emotional feelings, I think it is a great tool for helping people get through this and restoring some mental health. People talk about symptoms and medications. I'm not so sure a forum is a great vehicle or tool for helping that. But when it comes to the emotional aspects of a cardiac arrest, I think the forums they serve a great purpose and could go even further in helping people. But I think you guys are on the right track.
Mm-hmm. How do you think they could go further?
With some more moderation, perhaps, like a dedicated, I'm not saying you should hire a social worker or a psychologist or something, but if it was a guided conversation, and I think for that you need administrators or moderators who can jump in and help steer the conversation in a helpful way, as opposed to just, I'm a 3-year survivor. That's not helping. Something like that.
Yeah, I think that's true. It would be good to have professional help in there sometimes.
Yeah, I'm not sure it needs to be professional as much as someone just guides the conversation, trying to get to an end where people feel satisfied. So there's a conclusion to the question that was asked or the concern that was expressed. I think that, I don't know, other than that, I haven't given it much thought, but I think there must be lots of avenues, because we were talking about the first site where you and I, or where you met me, and I think one of the dissatisfactions there was it was a slow form. It was like snail mail, and as opposed to Facebook, where it's very interactive and it's very here and now. And secondly, that site wasn't moderated, whereas Facebook, there is some moderation in your site and other sites. And, people that have come through a cardiac arrest are not always considerate because of the state they're in, and it's not their fault perhaps, but sometimes moderation is very necessary. The feelings can get hurt otherwise, and the safe space can be eroded.
It's very true, very true. And wise words. I was going to finish on two things. Yep. I was going to ask how you are now, bearing in mind it's 6 years down the line, and whether you've got any tips or advice for anyone else. And then the last thing I was going to do is read your poem that you've got at the back of your book. I don't know if you've got it to hand, whether you want to actually read it as well.
Yeah, you're asking, it has been 6 years, and I feel great. It's been a long 6 years. As I said before, I think that the first 3 were the periods of great growth, and the last 3 were more periods of reflection. And I'm glad that I'm come to a point now where I can reflect back on those 3 years. In terms of tips or advice, I think being patient was a hard thing for me to do. Being patient and lowering or managing my expectations. And I think the other piece of advice I would have is that getting, and this is a hard thing to do, but getting away from that self-focus for me, the poor me, the why me, all that me business. And I know it's a devastating and emotionally draining experience to go through a cardiac arrest, but I found the more I could focus on other people, the healthier, the stronger I became. And helping other people, especially, to me, was a very affirming and gave helped restore my confidence in myself. I think it's far too easy to stay focused on oneself and just spiral into whatever you're going to spiral into, to the neglect of other people. So I would say to be patient and to try to think of other people, perhaps, are my tips.
Yeah, I think I would certainly reiterate those, in that I often used to say that time is a healer, and that's essentially what you're saying. Be patient, and I found it very rewarding helping others and being a member of the group. And that as you go through the months and the years, you learn a little bit more about what it means to be a survivor, and passing that knowledge on helps in both ways. You help someone else and you help yourself. So it's a win-win.
I totally agree. The poem, I guess I wrote I must a few years back, and this latest iteration is missing two lines, but we don't need to get into that.
Is it the last 2 lines?
No, there's a gap in the pamphlet in the poem, and there were two lines in there in which I tried to express where I was in between, and I found it a challenge to express something that I didn't experience, and I found it a challenge to express, like, how do you describe nothingness? And so I gave up. I realized that having a blank space in between would be a better expression of where I went and what happened to me than trying to describe it.
Oh, I understand now. I see what you mean about the gap in the text, the way you formatted it. Yeah, I did wonder why it was like that. I must admit.
Well, there used to be two lines in there, Paul, that said something about it was serene. It was, I don't know, it was a space between words or something. It just didn't capture. And also, I think it led people to interpret more than I was trying to say, as if I had actually gone somewhere.
Do you encounter questions about that?
Well, yeah, I mean, the whole afterlife, being dead, and the tunnel with Jesus or the family or whatever at the end of it. I didn't experience that, and people assume, I think, that perhaps that's what I was talking about, so I decided to let it go. And I think it stands more effective to me anyways. I'm more happy with it without those two lines. And the gap, I think, captures it. Not that anyone understands the gap.
Indeed.
But there it is.
I think maybe it's a good idea for a future podcast, that bit, what people have experienced in air quotes, near-death experience.
There seems to be a huge interest in that, I think mostly in the United States for some reason. Mm-hmm. But there seems to be a real huge interest in that down there as to proof of, which is how it's being interpreted, is proof of afterlife as opposed to people's experiences. Mm-hmm. But that's a whole podcast, you're right.
Indeed. So perhaps we could just finish on your reading of your poem. And I'd just like to say thank you very much for joining me on this. It's been really insightful to get your views on things. And if anyone's wondering what we're talking about with regards to Ted's book or pamphlet, as he describes it, I will be posting it into the group and also onto the website, just so that it's also available already in the International Sudden Cardiac Arrest group, and I believe you got it posted into or published into Amazon as well.
That's right. Yep. I just, Paul, want to thank you for all the wonderful work you're doing.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Okay.
And so go ahead, Ted. So thanks again.
So the poem's title, Requiem for a Sudden Cardiac Arrest. Amid the confusion and chest-thumping blows, I silently slipped where nobody knows. When the lights turned back on and time restarted, though I returned not the same as when I departed. While I long to go back to where I don't know, I just stare at the mirror, wondering where did I go?
Very good. I think it sums up very well that missing part of our lives. I always joke about whether I was abducted by aliens or whatever.
That would have been a nice explanation.
Well, thanks very much
again, Paul.
Reading that, and thank you for spending the time to talk to me.
Thank you.